Today, we meet a man whose very name has become an adjective in psychology, Carl Jung. You may not casually drop Jungian in everyday conversation, the way people speak of Freudian slips, but Jung's influence runs quietly through our culture. If you've ever described yourself as an introvert or extrovert, talked about someone's persona or shadow, or felt a story resonate with you on a mythic level, you've been touched by Jung's ideas. His concepts of archetypes, the collective unconscious, and the journey of individuation have seeped into how we understand ourselves, even if we don't always realize it. Carl Jung helped shape the language we use for the soul. Jung's story begins in Switzerland, at the turn of the 20th century, a world away from Freud's Viennese parlors, but stirred by similar questions about the human mind. Born in 1875 in a small Swiss village, Jung was the son of a Protestant minister. Spiritual questions were the backdrop of his childhood, yet he was also drawn to science and nature. As a boy, he read philosophy and filled notebooks with his own reflections. He felt, even then, that there were unseen depths to life, mysteries and dreams, in ancient stories, in the imagination, that called out to be explored. This tension between the scientific and the spiritual, the seen and the unseen, would become the central theme of his life's work. In the late 1890s, Jung chose to study medicine, and he gravitated to psychiatry almost by fate. Legend has it that as a medical student he stumbled upon a textbook on mental illnesses and was immediately captivated. Here was a field that combined the biological with the psychological, the measurable brain with the immeasurable mind. By 1900, Jung found himself working at the Burgholzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich, a leading center for treating mental disorders under the guidance of Eugen Bleuler, a pioneering psychiatrist. In the wards of Burgholzli, Jung encountered patients lost in worlds of delusions and hallucinations, cases of schizophrenia and hysteria that defied the simple explanations of the day. Where others saw only madness, Jung sensed that even these bewildering minds might be following some hidden logic or story. Ever the investigator, the young doctor, Jung devised experiments to peer into the unconscious. One of his early contributions was a simple but ingenious word association test. He would read a list of words to a patient, mother, water, death, house, and so on, and ask them to respond quickly with the first word that came to mind. Meanwhile, he timed their responses and noted any hesitation or emotional reactions. What he discovered was striking. Certain words would make a patient stumble or pause longer than usual, or elicit a strange expression. A seemingly innocuous term like father or love might provoke discomfort or a physical twitch. Jung realized these troubled reactions were clues to what he called complexes, emotionally charged clusters of associations, often rooted in painful or sensitive subjects that the person's conscious mind would rather avoid. If someone hesitated after mother, it suggested there was a whole tangle of unconscious feelings and memories, a mother complex, lurking below the surface of their mind. This was a remarkable insight. It showed that the unconscious wasn't just an abstract idea. It could be observed in action, catching a person off guard in a moment's pause or a slip of the tongue. Jung's findings from the word association experiment quickly caught the attention of the era's leading explorer of the mind's hidden depths, Sigmund Freud. Freud had already revolutionized psychology with his idea that our psyche is largely driven by unconscious forces. When Jung, the curious Swiss psychiatrist, sent him a copy of his research, Freud took notice. Here was a kindred spirit, and importantly to Freud, one outside the German-speaking Jewish circle of early psychoanalysts, who offered experimental evidence for the unconscious and the concept of repressed emotions. The two began corresponding. And in 1907, a historic meeting took place in Vienna. Jung traveled to meet Freud, and what was supposed to be a short visit turned into a marathon conversation lasting some 13 hours. Imagine two brilliant minds, one in his 50s and the other in his early 30s, locked in animated discussion from afternoon through the dead of night, utterly engrossed in charting the map of the human psyche. Freud was impressed with Jung's intellect and enthusiasm. Jung, in turn, was electrified by Freud's bold theories and the promise of a new psychology that fearlessly probed the unconscious. A deep friendship and collaboration was born in that single sitting. For several years after, Jung became Freud's closest ally and heir apparent. Freud, who had faced criticism and isolation for his controversial ideas, was delighted to have an energetic younger colleague to carry the torch of psychoanalysis. He famously called Jung his crown prince and even a spiritual son. In 1910, Freud engineered Jung's election as the first president of the International Psychoanalytical Association. Together, they hoped to establish the study of the unconscious as a legitimate scientific discipline and a therapeutic practice. It was an exciting alliance, the elder pioneer and the young prodigy, and it marked a coming of age for the field of psychology itself. No longer would psychological truth be dictated solely by philosophers or confined to university labs. Here were clinicians, listening to patients' dreams and childhood memories, treating the psyche on its own terms. Yet beneath the warm collegiality, there were fault lines. In hindsight, that very first marathon conversation between Freud and Jung contained seeds of future disagreement. They shared a fascination with the unconscious, but they did not always see it in the same way. Freud, shaped by the strict mores of Victorian Vienna, had concluded that at the bottom of our mental life lay repressed infantile sexual desires, a cauldron of forbidden urges that society forces us to push down, only for them to resurface in neuroses and dreams. Jung had a different temperament and background. As the son of a pastor and a man intrigued by spiritual traditions, Jung was open to a wider range of human experience as psychologically meaningful. He did not believe that sexuality, important as it is, could account for all the mysteries of the soul. To Jung, Freud's vision of the unconscious seemed constrained, a basement filled only with repressed wishes and ugly impulses. Jung sensed that the unconscious might also include loftier elements, creativity, spiritual yearning, and ancestral memory. Over time, the cracks in their partnership widened. Freud grew concerned, even annoyed, at Jung's inclination towards mysticism and symbolism. Jung, for his part, began to chafe under what he felt was Freud's dogmatic insistence on sexual theory above all else. They had vigorous debates, for example, about religion. Freud saw religious faith as an illusion, a collective neurosis fueled by childish needs for a father figure in the sky. Jung, however, observed that religious symbols and mystical experiences often had a powerful healing or guiding function for the psyche. He felt that dismissing them outright was a mistake. It cut psychology off from something profound in human nature. Similarly, when Jung began to compare the fantasies of psychiatric patients to mythological themes, noting how a patient's hallucinations might echo an ancient myth or fairy tale, Freud bristled. He suspected that Jung was drifting into occult waters and feared it would undermine the credibility of psychoanalysis. The breaking point came in 1912. Jung published a book originally titled Psychology of the Unconscious, later revised and known as Symbols of Transformation. In this work, he dared to reframe some of Freud's foundational ideas. While Freud had described libido as a primarily sexual energy, Jung reconceived libido as a more general life energy, a creative psychic energy that could express itself in myriad ways, not just through sexual drives. And rather than focus only on the personal history of a patient, Jung's book delved into comparative mythology, drawing parallels between an individual's inner experiences and the symbols found in ancient stories and religions. It was an audacious synthesis, an attempt to widen the scope of psychoanalysis into something more expansive, which Jung would soon call analytical psychology. Freud, however, saw it as a betrayal. To him, Jung's deviations were heresy against the psychoanalytic creed he had so carefully built. The personal element made it sting all the more. His chosen son was rejecting the very core of his teachings. After the publication of Jung's book, the correspondence between Freud and Jung turned cold and contentious. Their letters show Freud trying to pull Jung back into line, and Jung firmly standing his ground. By 1913, the rupture was complete. Jung resigned his positions in Freud's circle. Freud, deeply hurt, severed contact. At a psychoanalytic congress that year, they barely spoke to each other. What had been one of the great intellectual friendships of the age collapsed into silence. The split between Freud and Jung was more than just a personal falling out. It symbolized psychology's growing pains, the moment the young science stretched beyond one man's vision. Freud's path and Jung's path diverged, and with that, psychology itself branched into new directions. For Carl Jung, the The break with Freud was devastating and liberating all at once. On the surface, he was a respected doctor in his late 30s with a wife and children, living in a comfortable home by Lake Zurich. But inwardly, he was in turmoil. In losing Freud, Jung had lost not only a friend and mentor, but an entire community of colleagues. Virtually overnight, he became an outsider to the psychoanalytic movement he had helped build. He later described the years after 1913 as a midlife isolation. He felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under him and he was falling into himself. And in a very real sense, that is exactly what he did. He fell into the depths of his own mind. What followed is one of the most extraordinary self-experiments in the history of psychology. Jung decided to face the unconscious on its own terms, using himself as the guinea pig. Without Freud or anyone else to consult, he turned inward. He began to encourage visions and fantasies in a kind of waking dream practice he called active imagination. At times he feared he might be slipping into psychosis as he saw vivid, sometimes terrifying images. Floods engulfing Europe, blood covering the land, serpents, fiery beings, and even the presence of faceless beings he felt were ancient gods. Instead of dismissing these as mere hallucinations, Jung engaged with them. Every day after seeing his few remaining patients, he would retreat to his study, allow his mind to drift, and record what he saw and heard in meticulous detail. He sketched scenes from his visions, painted mandalas, circular symbols, and conversed with the figures that appeared to him, treating them as voices of the psyche. During this period, which lasted for several intense years around the time of the First World War, Jung filled notebook after notebook with accounts of his dialogues with the unconscious. He later transcribed and illustrated many of these experiences in a large red leather journal, which came to be known as the Red Book, though he showed it to almost no one during his lifetime. In it, Jung grappled with his own demons and angels, so to speak. He encountered characters in his imagination that represented parts of himself, a wise old man named Philemon who became a sort of inner guide, a young adventurous man, a dark serpent, a regal female presence, and other mysterious figures. It was as if he had descended into a personal underworld, a mythic realm beneath ordinary consciousness, and returned with new insights like treasures from the deep. What were those insights? Slowly, the chaos of Jung's inner journey began to coalesce into order, a new vision of how the human psyche is structured. The first realization was that Freud had been right about the unconscious, but also incomplete. There was more in the unconscious than individual forgotten experiences. Jung perceived that, beyond the personal layer of the unconscious, the layer formed from one's own life events and repressed traumas, there was a deeper layer that did not come from personal experience at all. He started to call this the collective unconscious. It was, in his view, a vast reservoir of inherited psychological material shared by all humankind. How did he come to this idea? As Jung compared the images in his dreams and fantasies with the myths and art of other cultures, he was astonished by the parallels. In his visions, he had seen an old man with wings and the horns of a bull. Later, he found depictions of an ancient winged bull man in Persian mythology that matched it. He dreamt of a great flood and a sea of blood washing over Europe. Soon after, World War I erupted, and he felt he had tapped into a collective premonition of the catastrophe. These kinds of correspondences convinced him that deep down, our minds speak in a universal language of symbols. Just as the human body has a common anatomy, 2 eyes, a heart, 5 fingers on each hand, the psyche has a common structure that transcends our individual lives. Jung called those common patterns archetypes. An archetype, as he defined it, is like a primordial image or fundamental psychic pattern that lives in the collective unconscious of all people. We're not born as blank slates. We inherit certain potential ways of seeing and being. Think of archetypes as the original templates of human experience, which each of us still carries. They are not conscious ideas, but tendencies to form images and symbols that we all recognize. For example, almost every culture throughout history has stories of a hero, a figure, often of humble birth, who must go on a journey, face trials, slay a dragon, or overcome great odds and return transformed. This is the hero archetype, and it appears in countless guises, from the ancient Greek Heracles, Hercules, to Luke Skywalker and Harry Potter in modern storytelling. Another ubiquitous archetype is the Great Mother, sometimes nurturing and protective, like the Virgin Mary, or a Mother Earth goddess, and sometimes fearsome and destructive, like Kali or the wicked stepmother in fairy tales. There is the wise old man or wise old woman, offering guidance. Think of a Gandalf or a fairy godmother. There is the trickster, the innocent child, the lover, the shadowy doppelganger, a whole cast of characters that repeatedly populate our myths, dreams, and imaginations. Crucially, Jung observed that these archetypes show up not only in myths and literature, but in our personal lives as well, especially in our dreams. For instance, a modern businessman might dream of climbing a mountain and meeting a sage at the summit, a manifestation of the wise old man archetype, perhaps symbolizing the dreamer's search for wisdom beyond material success. A young child who feels powerless might daydream about a superhero, the hero archetype giving them courage in fantasy form, or consider how often we idolize a new romantic partner, seeing them as the perfect knight or princess, only to later discover their human imperfections. In that early infatuation, Jung would say, we are projecting the anima or animus archetype, an inner ideal image, onto the other person. Archetypes, according to Jung, act as energy centers in the psyche. They organize and propel our emotions and behavior in ways we barely realize. When we fall in love, when we fear the dark, when we seek a mentor, when we feel small under a starry sky, archetypal forces are at work, linking us to the whole history of humanity's psyche. Among the many archetypes Jung described, a few became central to his psychology because they illuminate the relationship between our conscious selves and the vast unconscious. One is the persona. This archetype is like the mask we wear in public, the role or face we present to the world. The very word, persona, comes from the Latin word for the masks actors wore on stage. Jung used it to mean our social personality, the part of us that conforms to expectations and norms. If you think about it, we all cultivate a persona from childhood onward. We learn that we should behave in certain ways to be accepted. So we push forward the qualities that society rewards and hide the parts that might invite disapproval. This usually results in a persona that embodies our more socially acceptable traits, while the less desirable parts of ourselves get pushed out of sight. And that leads to the archetype Jung famously called the shadow. The shadow exists as the dark counterpart to the persona. It's composed of all the qualities we deny in ourselves, not just what we might consider bad or immoral traits, but anything that doesn't fit our chosen self-image. If the persona is our public mask, the shadow is the face in the mirror that we turn away from. It contains our repressed weaknesses, secret envies, unacceptable impulses, and all the things we're afraid or ashamed to admit about ourselves. Jung taught that the shadow isn't purely evil. It is simply everything we have not brought into the light of consciousness. Where there is light, there must also be shadow, he wrote, reminding us that no one can be all goodness and light without also having a dark side. In fact, the more strenuously a person identifies with being upright and virtuous, often the larger and more forceful their shadow will be, because all the unacceptable urges have been banished to it and left to fester. One reason to acknowledge the shadow is that if we don't, it has a way of making itself known indirectly. Often this happens through projection. We project our shadow qualities onto others. The traits that irritate or anger us most in someone else can be clues to what we're denying in ourselves. For example, a person who prides themselves on being always polite and calm might find themselves irrationally angry at someone who is loud or confrontational, possibly because deep down, they have rage or assertiveness they've never allowed themselves to express. By facing our own shadow, perhaps admitting, yes, I too have aggressive impulses, we rob it of the power to control us from behind the scenes. Jung believed that integrating the shadow is a vital part of becoming a whole person. It doesn't mean acting out everything in the shadow. It means recognizing those tendencies as part of you, so they no longer unconsciously sabotage your life or get dumped on others. Another archetypal pair that Jung introduced is the anima and animus. These represent the contrasexual aspect of a person's psyche. The inner feminine side of a man, the anima, and the inner masculine side of a woman, the animus. In Jung's view, because humans have lived together as men and women for eons, we all carry some imprint of the opposite sex in our psyche. Culturally, in Jung's time, and often still today, men were encouraged to embody masculine qualities like reason, aggression, independence, and to disown feminine qualities like sentiment, tenderness, receptivity, and vice versa for women. Jung's concept of anima, animus, was radical in suggesting that true wholeness means a man must understand and integrate his inner feminine, and a woman her inner masculine. The anima in a man might appear in dreams or fantasies as a female figure who captivates or guides him, representing qualities in himself that he needs to acknowledge, such as compassion or intuition. The animus in a woman might show up as a male figure offering firm opinion or insight, perhaps symbolizing her own latent assertiveness or intellect. These archetypes often influence our relationships. As mentioned, a man might fall hopelessly in love at first sight because the woman before him so perfectly mirrors his anima ideal. In essence, he's not just seeing her, he's seeing his soul's image. A woman might feel irrationally drawn to or repelled by a man who embodies her animus image of authority or wisdom. Recognizing this dynamic can prevent a lot of heartache. And projection. Jung saw the union of masculine and feminine aspects within an individual as essential to psychological maturity. He was notably ahead of his time in suggesting that masculine and feminine traits are not the exclusive province of one gender or the other. Every person needs a balance. All of this, confronting the shadow, integrating anima animus, coming to terms with archetypes shaping one's life, feeds into what Jung considered the ultimate aim of psychological development, individuation. Individuation, as Jung described it, is the lifelong process of becoming the true individual you are meant to be. It's not about becoming perfect or even happy in a simplistic way. It's about becoming real, whole, and in harmony with the depths of your own being. Think of it as the unfolding of the seed of potential that is you, into the unique personality that only you can become. Individuation involves integrating the conscious and unconscious parts of the mind and resolving the internal conflicts that arise between them. Early in life, we develop an ego and a persona to deal with the world, and we tend to identify with that constructed self-image. But as life goes on, often in the second half of life, there comes a call from within to go beyond the mask, to dig up what was buried, the shadow, the neglected talents, the repressed feelings, and to integrate it. The hero's journey that myths speak of is, in a Jungian sense, a metaphor for individuation, leaving the comfortable known world, the ego's identity, venturing into the unknown, the unconscious, facing dragons, our fears, our shadows, finding the treasure, the true self, and returning with it to enrich life. For Jung himself, his confrontation with the unconscious after the break with Freud was his personal individuation crisis. He let the edifice of the dutiful doctor and Freud's protege crumble, and through that descent into chaos, he found a deeper self emerging. He believed that if we ignore the individuation urge, we risk stagnation, neurosis, or a life that feels unfulfilled. The psyche will demand growth, one way or another. On the other hand, if we consciously engage with it, through self-reflection, through examining our dreams and emotions, perhaps through therapy or creative work, we participate in a natural process of self-realization. Jung sometimes called individuation a kind of midlife rebirth, where the goal is not to become someone else, but to become who you truly are. Jung's emphasis on individuation and the quest for meaning marked a turning point in psychology's history. At a time when many psychologists were focused either on lab experiments or on treating mental illness in purely clinical terms, Jung was carving out a place for the inner journey in the conversation. He insisted that science alone, valuable as it is, could not answer the human need for meaning. Modern people, he observed, often suffered from a loss of connection to the symbols and myths that gave life meaning in earlier eras. Psychology, in Jung's approach, could help restore that connection by providing a bridge between the rational mind and the symbolic, mythic imagination. Take alchemy, for example. In the 1920s and 30s, while others might have laughed off the medieval alchemists as crackpots trying to literally make gold, Jung spent years studying their obscure texts and diagrams. He came to realize that the alchemists were inadvertently describing psychological processes under the guise of chemical experiments. They spoke of breaking down substances and recombining them, of purifying base metals, of the conjunctio, the sacred union of opposites, and of the miraculous philosopher's stone that could heal all ills. To Jung, this was strikingly parallel to what happens in individuation. The prima materia, or base matter that the alchemists sought to refine, could be seen as the raw psyche. The various stages of heating, cooling, dissolving, and coagulating were like the trials and conflicts one undergoes in psychotherapy or inner work. The union of opposites, sun and moon, king and queen in alchemical imagery, mirrored the integration of conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine within the person, and the gold or philosopher's stone symbolized the self. He integrated whole personality that results. In short, the alchemists were performing a drama of individuation in their laboratories without realizing it. Jung published works on alchemy and showed how eerily the alchemical symbols corresponded to dream symbols he'd encountered in his patients and himself. This bold integration of ancient mysticism with modern psychology was typical of Jung's approach. He would draw wisdom from any source if it illuminated the workings of the psyche. Jung similarly engaged with Eastern philosophies and religions. He read the texts of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism, and found in them rich descriptions of inner states that Western psychology had barely begun to name. Concepts like meditation, karma, or the mandala intrigued him as psychological phenomena, ways the human psyche seeks wholeness and balance. When Jung traveled to India, he conversed with Indian scholars and holy men, reflecting on the Eastern understanding of the mind. In one famous introduction, he wrote about the Tibetan Book of the Dead, not as a literal guide to the afterlife, but as a map of the transition between states of consciousness, something he related to psychological transformation. He also visited Taos Pueblo in New Mexico and was deeply moved by the Native American worldview. The Pueblo elders told him that white men seemed uneasy and restless because they thought with their heads, whereas the Pueblo thought with their hearts. This, to Jung, was a succinct diagnosis of Western alienation. Too much intellect, not enough connection to the deep well of being. Not everyone in the scientific community appreciated Jung's broad approach. Many academic psychologists of the mid-20th century were steering toward behaviorism, which ignored inner life in favor of observable behavior, or toward strict medical psychiatry, which reduced mental problems to brain chemistry. To them, Jung's excursions into mythology and religion might have seemed uncomfortably unscientific. Freud himself, even after their break, remained the more established figure in university circles for quite some time. Whereas Jung's followers developed their own institutes to train analysts in Zurich, London, New York, and beyond. Jung was respected, yes, but also viewed warily by some as a mystic rather than a scientist. But ironically, as time went on, Jung's ideas seeped into the culture in ways academic theories did not. The world of art and literature eagerly embraced Jungian concepts. Novelists and filmmakers found inspiration in archetypal patterns like the hero's journey, a concept which itself owes a debt to Jung's insights. Therapists looking for ways to help patients find meaning in life gravitated toward Jung's humanistic, growth-oriented perspective. In the 1960s and 70s, a wave of interest in spirituality, human potential, and alternative psychology brought Jung's work back into the spotlight for a new generation disillusioned with purely materialist views of the mind. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, a personality test still widely used today, is directly based on Jung's theory of psychological types, his framework of introversion, extroversion, and thinking-feeling orientations. Terms Jung coined, such as complex or archetype, became part of everyday speech. Even the word synchronicity, which Jung introduced to describe meaningful coincidences that aren't causally connected, entered the vernacular and remains a popular concept for those moments when life feels oddly, fatefully interconnected. Carl Jung lived long enough to see himself become something of a wise elder of psychology. In his later years, he often retreated to a quiet stone tower he built on the shore of Lake Zurich, a personal sanctuary where he could live simply, chop wood, and reflect in solitude. He carved symbols and sayings into its walls and spent his days writing, painting, and enjoying the freedom of anonymity away from the public eye. Visitors who ventured to meet him there found not an austere professor, but a grandfatherly figure, tending a fire or strolling by the water, willing to discuss dreams, myths, or the fate of humanity with a twinkle in his eye. Jung remained intellectually active to the end, corresponding with friends and admirers around the world and delving into new curiosities. He passed away peacefully in 1961 at the age of 85, by which time he was internationally recognized as one of psychology's great pioneers, even if some of his more unorthodox ideas were still ahead of their time. Carl Jung expanded the frontiers of psychology at a crucial moment when it was defining itself as a new science. He demonstrated that a psychologist could examine not only the brain and behavior, but also dreams, symbols, myths, and spiritual questions, and still treat it as rigorous inquiry. In Jung's view, the psyche itself was real and worthy of study, even if its depths could not be measured in a laboratory. He had broken away from the purely medical model of mental illness, and from purely philosophical speculation, forging a discipline that engages both science and the human quest for meaning. Psychology, thanks in part to Jung, became a field that could bridge the clinical and the cultural, the empirical and the existential. Perhaps the best summary of Jung's message is one of his own lines: "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." The treasures he brought up from the unconscious depths have helped wake up countless people to their own inner reality. In Jung's mirror, we see that our personal struggles and dreams are part of something bigger, the eternal human story, full of archetypal actors and ancient themes, ever unfolding through each of us. And by understanding that story, we take a step toward owning it, toward guiding it, and maybe even toward healing ourselves. Carl Jung devoted his life to mapping the psyche's night sea journey, and in doing so, he lit lanterns that still guide us today, as psychology sails onward, charting the mysterious seas of the human mind.
Old portraits in a cedar box, worn edges fray with time. I trace the faces, faded locks, their eyes become a sign. Winter fields beneath gray skies, horizon thin and low. Each breath I take recalls their lives and the long way home. And the night sings low like a lonesome hymn, calling me back through the hollows dim to where the heart is grown. Though my steps have wandered far and wide, the road still whispers, you're on your way back home. Frozen creek bed underfoot, the ice cracks soft and thin. My shadow dances on the mud like memory wearing thin. An empty porch, a rocking chair, dust settled on the frame. In every sigh, lonely air, I hear an old name. The night sings low like a lonesome hymn, calling me back through the hollows dim to where the heart is grown. Oh, my steps have wandered far and wide, the road still whispers, you're on your way back home. Now the lantern's glow welcomes me in, welcomes me in. Warm hearth and faces worn by kin, each step the past reclaims. Fold the photographs back in their home and lay my heart to rest the long